Echo of Death, a Tom and Scott mystery, fifth book in the series. By Mark Richard Zubro, publisher, St. Martin's Press, New York, narrator, Eric Ost. Acknowledgements. For their kind help and patience, Barb D'Amato, Hugh Holton, Rick Paul, and Kathy Pekaiser Reed. Chapter 9. Bill Proctor ripped open the box. I turned on the dome light. He pulled out layers of wrapping paper. "Aha!" he exclaimed. I looked over. It was a 5-inch by 5-inch stone carving of an ugly head attached to a lumpy body. "This is what people have been dying for?" I asked. We found 4 more relics, all completely intact. No way did it look as if you could break them apart to reveal hidden jewels or wealth inside. Carefully, we unfolded each scrap of wrapping paper, blank thin tissue, and rough coarse cardboard. Not a word written anywhere. I jumped down from the cab, hefted one of the relics, and prepared to dash it on the ground. "Hold it!" Proctor commanded. He held the slightly shredded corner of the box. "There's paper with the writing on it wedged in here." He extricated it carefully. It looked as if each flap of the box had been slit open and re-glued. All of them contained information. The one I opened contained records of fake and real relics, along with paper. Bill's had computer disks, one labeled Mom, the other Dad. On the paper were lists of names and dates and what looked to be notations in code. Proctor held up the paper from the flap. He'd been working on. He held it to the light. "These are addresses in cities around the world. There are only 5. One is in Chicago." My heart began to hammer. I snatched the paper from his hand. "This is what we're looking for. These must be the safe houses." I didn't recognize the addresses for the one in Chicago, but it had to be somewhere on the south side. "We've got to take all this to the police," Proctor said. "We've got to sort all this out." I waved the paper with the addresses. "I'm going to take this and go get Scott. They must have taken him to this address." Proctor didn't try to discourage me with, "Maybe they took him someplace else. Can we be sure it's this place? Won't it be dangerous?" I wouldn't have listened anyway. I floored the truck and sped away. "I don't understand the computer stuff," Proctor said as we neared Lakeshore Drive. "Got to be the work he was doing for your mom and dad down there." "That stuff in code too? Probably," he said. I lit Proctor out at Chicago Hilton Towers. He could grab a cab there and take everything to the police. "You should wait for cops and backup on this," he said. "No way. I'm not waiting for explanations, warrants, and plans. He's there. I'm going to get him." He patted my shoulder. "I'll get this done quickly. Help is on the way." Dawn was just breaking as I drove east to State Street and then back south to 26th Street. I paused. The light of the city were still on. Most of the motorists still had their headlights on. My quarry was one more block south. I turned east once more to the middle of the block. The alley was dirt-encrusted and garbage-strewn with broken buildings and ominous shadows. Just what I wanted for cover in approaching the address I eased into the alley, pulled the truck into low, and inched forward. This alley was a delight of urban blight, topped off with the elevated tracks. I rocked over potholes and dodged the metal pilings to the far end. I stopped and let the engine idle while I took in the scene. 3/4 of the way down, at the other end of the block I faced was an L station. 3 immense row houses were all that were left on the block between 27th and 28th Streets, with State Street on the west and Wabash on the east. The abandoned buildings on this block had been ripped down. What was left were 3 grand old dams of bygone era before the near north side became a haven of the rich, when the near south side of Chicago was the place where the wealthy lived and played. They clustered tightly together in a row on the west side of the street, facing toward the not-too-distant Williams Park. The first house was a picturesque pile of red brick that abutted right onto the sidewalk. It may have been one of the first homes built there, and the street may have reached up to it. A cast-iron fence of potholes, spaced 6 inches apart, began at the back of the building and extended 20 feet to the crumbling remnants of a cobblestone alley. The fence turned and followed the property of all 3 houses, and then turned back in at the far end. No barriers divided the backyards. One lone tree, set just outside the property at the southeast side, I pulled out and drove to the left down 26th Street. A few feet later, I made a right and turned into Wabash. I cruised down the block, trying simultaneously to keep my eyes on the houses, watch where I was driving, and looking conspicuous. Half of the houses on my left were boarded up, and the other half looked as though they wished they'd been. I turned right on 27th Street and right again on State Street. I was moving directly in front of all three of the old mansions. None of the windows was broken out. Through a picture window on the first floor, the one on the corner, I saw a lamp glowing. I continued on up State Street, back to 25th, and drove back to the alley, and came back to resume my perch in the shadows. I parked as close as I could to the burned-out hulk of the former home at the end of the alley. The broken and crumbling back porch of the corner house across the street seemed to offer a possible egress. The fence started at the end of the porch, but the slats connecting porch to ground looked jagged and rotting in the dim streetlight. I had seen no other possibility of entering unobserved in my circuit around the houses. I waited for an old Plymouth to clink past me and struggled through the light at the corner. I lit myself out of the cab and flitted from shadow to shadow in the gloom cast by the tracks. One last glance revealed that no light shone on this side of the house. I rushed to the porch bottom, yanked two boards out of the way so I could fit, then plunged through the opening. On hands and knees I scurried forward. The ground was packed dirt and debris in the middle of the porch. Streetlights and the new dawn shone enough for me to see an opening to a crawl space under the house. My hands immediately began to sink a good inch into the damp ground. The crawl space was so small that I was forced to use my knees and elbows to pull myself along. I crawled through the mud and slime inch by inch. The first rat scuttled away on my right. It had to be a close relative of the huge rodents in the tunnels under the loop. The second rat paused for a few seconds before running off to the left. The coming dawn and the streetlights barely illuminated more than a yard or two on either side of me, but it was enough to show me more rats. Their eyes were yellow and red-rimmed, and they were now giving more hesitation before turning to run. I had no light and no weapon, but I knew that somewhere in the labyrinth above me was Scott, captured, tortured, maybe dead. I tried burying that last thought, but knew with more certainty than the sunrise that if my lover was dead, everyone responsible would die. The slime and ooze had long since soaked through the front of my sweatshirt and pants. I rested my chin in the mud for a few seconds, lifting my eyes under my brows to see ahead. One rat, perhaps bolder than the rest, or maybe crazed with rabies, took a step or two toward me. I knew I needed to keep moving. I plowed and elbowed through the muck. Rats now scampered a few feet, then stopped. I forced my knees and elbows and hands and torso. Anything that could edge me forward to move. I stopped every few feet for a quick examination of the floor. Inches from my head, I still hadn't found an opening into the houses. My assumption that there would be an opening, or that I would be able to see it, faded as I moved forward toward deeper darkness. The occasional sound of the L pounding along nearby and a few stray cats were the only other sounds besides that of the creepy critters close to me. My eyes grasped at any protuberance that might indicate an opening upward. Finally, I caught sight of a cylindrical device off to my left. I inched through the muck, ignored the filth, and thought only of saving Scott. Minutes later, I arrived at what I guessed to be a hot water heater. The crawl space here was wide enough that I could move on my hands and knees. I knew there had to be an access door nearby. I propped myself on one elbow and gently prodded on the ceiling of the crawl space. My elbow sank 3 inches into the slime. I made my way around the object, pausing to reach up and examine a space of about 3 square feet at a time above me. I hunted more by feel than by sight. My neck began to ache from the unnatural position in which I had to hold my head. I made a complete circuit, but found nothing. I needed to expand my area of feel. I lowered my arm for the last touch and looked back. Patches of light leaked through in a few places. I could have waited until full morning, but the already slim chances of finding Scott alive would have diminished even more. I also saw the movement of furry creatures. I wasn't planning on spending enough time down here to develop significant relationships with this branch of the vermin elite. I peered into the darkness farther ahead. Was that another cylinder off to my right? Maybe. Did I stay around this one and search for the crawlspace entrance that had to be there, or try my luck with the next object? I decided to try the space in direct line between the two cylinders. I took 2 steps with each limb, looked and touched and crawled on. On my 5th try, the ceiling gave slightly on my first push. Now came the next problems. Would the opening be unlocked? If I pushed it open, would I find a room full of bad guys staring at me amusedly with machine guns ready to blaze away, or would I have another chance of finding my lover? Of course, I didn't have much choice. I flipped onto my back to get more leverage and pushed upward. Again, the ooze immediately sank into every part of my clothing that touched the ghastly goo under me. The square of board gave a fraction more, and I saw lines of light appear around the edges. Was this good or bad? Did it mean that someone was in the room above with the light on? Or was I seeing the glow from the first light of day shining through the window in the room? I was well under the middle of the 3 buildings. It hardly seemed that it could be an outside room. I pushed again. The door stuck. I swore. The squeak of verminous beast sounded from above, 10 feet away from my head. I pushed again. Nothing. I flipped onto my stomach. Yellow eyes edged away, but not far. I positioned my back against the only possible exit above. I squatted down, resting the palms of my hands in the mire. I waited for the rumble of a passing L. It might have been 5 minutes, maybe at least 10, before I heard that glorious rumble. I tried to stand. The wood of the hatch ground into the bottom of my spine. I drove upward with all the strength of my legs, balancing myself on my fingertips. Suddenly, there was a horrendous squeal, that which a rusty hinge gives when being moved for the first time in years. I could tell that any critters nearby scattered because their squeaks disappeared. I dropped to my knees and twisted around. The sound of the L faded. I hoped it had been enough to cover the noise. I listened carefully for any steps on the floor above. I hadn't heard any so far. I waited as long as I could bear in stillness. I wouldn't need to issue an invitation to attack to the denizens of the underworld above. I pushed at the square of ceiling. I could move it maybe 1.5 inches. I thought of pounding at it. I waited for another L to pass. Then I tried shoving at it with all my might. I got another horrendous sound of complaining rust and metal, but it refused to open. I let the doorway back down and drew a deep breath. This would have to be my last try, even with the L. The noise I was making couldn't be ignored or missed much longer. Once more, I waited for the noise of the L. One of the few times I wished rush hour would hurry up and arrive. The roar began, and once more, my back to the floor, I tried to stand. Every instant of running and working out got put into this push, along with my love for Scott. I heard a squeal, but kept pushing, and then a sudden snap, a clatter, and the door burst upward, and my head bashed into a 2x4 on the underside of the floor. For a second, I felt dizzy, then touched the back of my head. My hand came away feeling wet. I didn't need to look to tell it was blood, nor would the creatures in the crawlspace need to see it either. Blood would make them even bolder. I scrambled along, stuck my head through the portal, got my shoulders through, and rested my elbows on either side for a second. I glanced around the room. I no longer had to wonder about what happened to Brad Stawalski. His pale and inert body lay a foot away from my left elbow. I crushed the thought out of my head of what this meant, about the possibility of finding Scott alive, but tried to take reassurance that I was on the right track, and this building was where Scott would be found. I was in a laundry room with a washer and dryer that couldn't have been used since the end of the first Mayor Daley's administration. A bare bulb above a warped and peeling door emitted a feeble light. After a moment of listening, I hoisted myself up and replaced the square of floor. Once on my feet, I listened intently again. Nothing. The room required only a cursory examination. It was about 10 feet square, with bare shelves on the walls. My clothes were a filth-encrusted mess. Brushing them off was useless. My hands were just as slime-covered, and there wasn't time. An oak door was the only exit, beside that which I'd entered. I didn't want to think of returning to my verminous friends. I tried the door, and the first thing that had gone right since the last ice age, the knob turned. I flicked down the light switch next to the door, but Nothing happened. The door must be controlled from somewhere else. I pulled out my hanky and used it to cover my fingers as I unscrewed the bulb. I edged the door open, listening for any possible sound from it, or of human habitation from the other side. The wood of the door was an inch thick. I extended more care than an archaeologist entering an ancient tomb for the first time. I pulled it open far enough so that a crack gave me the beginnings of a view of the room on the other side. No humans presented themselves to my immediate range of vision. A humming roar suddenly built to a din that awakened echoes of Vietnam in my mind. A helicopter was landing nearby. The roar turned into the whomping sounds of the propeller of a helicopter winding down. I edged the door further open. I looked into a room with a rusting refrigerator and a sink dangling from one pipe, jutting from the wall. No tables or chairs and no doors on gaping and empty cabinets. This house must be unoccupied. That and the noise of the L must have covered the sound of my entry. Through a window, the gray of early dawn gave me a brief look at the prospect outside and the empty lot on the other side of the L track. I could see the rear propeller and a few inches of flying machine and the slowly rotating main propeller of the helicopter. I opened the door an eighth of an inch at a time, listening intently and barely breathing. Nothing moved near me. Then, through the window, I saw the top halves of three men, all wearing sports jackets and grim frowns. By now I had the door open a quarter of the way. I pulled it nearly closed, but left myself a view out the window. They walked to the left, never looking in my direction. As soon as they were out of sight, I swung open the door and hurried to the right. Each room presented the prospect of a heavy oak door, like the first one I had passed through. Each necessitated the care with which I eased through the first one. With my fear for Scott churning my nerves on fast forward, I explored the house. I don't know how I managed to keep my patience and care on slow motion. From looking out the front windows of the second room to the glow of the streetlights outside, I realized I was in the middle of the house. I'd either passed the entrances from below in the first house, or they weren't any. I wondered briefly when the help that Bill Proctor said he'd send would get here. I wasn't about to wait for anyone to rescue Scott, but at this point a little cavalry arriving in the nick of time wouldn't have bothered me. I explored beyond the kitchen into a dining room which led directly into what I assumed might have been a parlor or living room. I got enough light from the street lamps and near dawn to make my way carefully, although no obstructions presented themselves in any of the rooms. Only one room had a carpet with faded roses twirling and entwining around each other. They might have been multicolored and cheerful when the carpet was first installed, but now their tired petals and worn briars barely showed through the years of gray dust, dirt, and neglect. I crept across each floor, keeping close to the walls, hoping to eliminate any squeaks and groans in the floorboards. The homes connected at the back along what might have been a servant's entrance or quarter. I inched through this and began my exploration of the third house. Suddenly, I heard an agonizing yowl. Its pure sound of animal pain and fear could not disguise that it was Scott. He was nearby and alive. This last thought kept me from racing headlong to a rescue. I wanted us to get away, not simply for me to join him in being tortured and killed. The bellow ended in a gurgle and then a whisper of, "Please stop." The scream had been horrific, but his desperate plea, spoken in a cracked whisper, drove my fury to an icy calm, waiting to explode with volcanic anger. I knew immediately that whoever wrecked this agony would pay. I arrived at a set of parlor doors that opened to each side, rather than in or out. The house was old, and the floors had begun to sag toward the middle, preventing these doors from closing perfectly. I put my eye to the opening. I brought my hand to my mouth. No scream could express my horror and fear. 5 feet of floor separated the room I was in from the one across the hall. The doors of that room were flung wide open. Scott sat in a chair with one wrist handcuffed to a rung behind his back. His face was bloody pulp. His sweatshirt hung in tatters down his chest. The left sleeve of Scott's sweatshirt had been ripped up. The arm with a tattered cloth remnant scattered around it lay on a small table. Palm down, I watched as one of the men took hold of Scott's hand and turned it over. From elbow to wrist, I saw the results of cigarette burns. I smelled burnt flesh. Blood trickled down the back of his blonde hair, turning it a crimson orange. Rope was looped around his chest and stomach. I could see the welts on his wrist, where the flesh had been bruised as he tried to struggle. I saw only 3 guys. One turned Scott's hand over. The foot of another had a gun barrel resting on it. A third stood against the far wall, smoking a cigarette and looking bored. I didn't know how many might be out of my line of sight. The one smoking the cigarette said, "You should let me use the cattle prod on his nuts. I bet he'd jump. I like to watch them jump." A voice, not from the 2 guys I could see, said, "I still think we should cut his dick off and stuff it in his mouth. I've always wanted to be the one to do that." "Maybe later," said the one who turned Scott's hand over. He took a puff from a cigarette he'd been holding in his other hand. He blew a smoke ring toward the ceiling. Without asking questions or demanding answers, he casually placed the lit tip close to Scott's arm. The torturer examined the underside with care and precision. He seemed to be searching for a good spot to inflict the next jolt of pain. He drew in his breath, lightly grunted, sighed, and brought the lit tip to the inside of Scott's elbow. He paused an inch above the surface. He said, as if he were having a conversation with Scott, "You see, the trick is to do it long enough to inflict the most pain, but not so long that the cigarette goes out." He jammed the cigarette into Scott. Every muscle in my lover's body tried to pull away from the pain. A scream that could have reached the loop rent the air. For the next several minutes, I don't remember a conscious thought. No she-bear enraged by an attack on her cubs could have been more dangerous or deadly than I in those next few instants. I suppose it was a surprise more than anything else that gave me what little advantage I had. Probably I should have planned a diversion with more subtlety. I took each of the doors I was behind and threw them open. Before they had a chance to look in my direction, I was in the room with my hand on the barrel of the gun I'd seen, wrenching the weapon out of the startled creep's hands and toppling him over backward on his chair. The one who'd been torturing Scott reached for a long-barreled gun. Before it even swung in my direction, I put a bullet between his eyes. I didn't have time to enjoy the satisfaction of watching him collapse, because the guy with the cigarette aimed his gun at me. I leaped sideways, rammed into the table, and shoved it into his midsection. He doubled over silently. I reached across the table, grabbed his shirt front, and bashed his head on the table, unconscious. He slumped to the floor. The third guy jumped toward a couple of guns sitting on a table near the front window. "Don't move!" I bellowed. He whirled to face me with an awful grin and the maw of a gigantic weapon turned in my direction. I swung to the floor, rolled, and began firing. Somewhere in there I realized someone was screaming and shouting furious imprecations. It dawned on me that I was the one. I fired wildly at the gunman at the front. I couldn't see where I hit him, but he did collapse to the ground, moaning. I heard pounding footsteps coming from deeper in the house. I snatched another gun from the front table and, with one in each hand, marched to the sliding doors. I stood at the entry and poured a rain of fire from both of the guns toward the door at the far end of the room. After the booming echoes faded, I listened. No footsteps sounded, but I could hear a distant babble of confusion. I caught only snatches of, "Get back! What the hell's going on? I think I'm hit!" One gun clicked empty. I tossed it away and picked the third gun up from the table. I rushed to Scott. He was unconscious. I didn't waste time trying to rouse him. I made sure he was breathing, then untied the ropes holding him. I had no idea where the keys to the handcuffs were. I smashed the rung of the chair with the bottom of my shoe. Scott began to slump to the floor. I held him in my arms and tried to get him up. I still hadn't heard any sounds approaching, but I knew the killers would be back any time. I didn't want to try the hall and the door. I didn't want to take a step closer to our pursuers. Even with two guns, I knew their firepower could easily outgun mine, and that, very soon, an assault on the room had to be coming in seconds. I dragged Scott to the picture window. The drop outside was about 5 feet. We'd have to do it. I began to hear sounds approaching. I looked down at the creep lying near the window. I could see his shallow breathing. His gun was near my left foot. I eased Scott out of my arms, bent down, and picked up the gun by my foot. I held two guns awkwardly in my left hand as I aimed the one in my right toward the doorway, emptied it in their direction, and tossed it away. I kept one gun in my right hand and the other in my belt. Then I turned and shot out the glass in the window. I didn't have time for finesse. I propped Scott on the edge of the windowsill, dangling his feet in front of him. I tried to lower him, but I had no time to be careful. He slipped and tumbled to the ground. When I was halfway through the window, I looked back to see the head of a figure appear around the door. I fired a round and scrambled out the window. I just missed landing on Scott. Not a car crept by on the deserted street. I didn't want to be exposed on the pavement for even a few seconds. I didn't know when enemies might rush out of the buildings. My truck was on the far side of the three houses. The stairs to the elevated station loomed a short half block to my left. The only protection on the way was the pilings of the L, but I'd have to risk it. Staying there was pointless. I picked Scott up in a fireman's carry and hefted him to my shoulder. I kept my gun arm as free as possible. He was heavy, and I staggered under his weight. The years of forcing myself to work out when I'd rather have taken another helping of chocolate paid off now. We worked out at least 3 nights a week during the off-season, and I continued the regimen while Scott plays in the summer. If I wasn't in good shape, this would have been hopeless. Still, if help didn't come soon, we'd never make it. I heard guns firing behind me. I risked a glance back. No one followed, but it sounded like a firefight going on inside the houses. I made it to the bottom of the steps to the L without being fired upon. It was still too early for rush hour crowds to stream to work. I didn't dare rest. Halfway up to the L platform, a train roared into the station. I surged upward and stumbled. I'd never make it before the train left. No one exited. The train started quickly, built speed, and left in a wild rush. When the noise stopped, I heard a gunfire close by and the pings of shells hitting the metal of the stairs. I fired several rounds back and then forged ahead, hoping the cover of the metal pilings would be enough protection. Their battle or confusion was over, and they were after us. At least on the platform, I'd have the upper ground to withstand a siege and maybe find a way to escape. Puffing up the stairs with Scott was tough, but I had enough of a lead. I thought I'd make it before they caught up. I certainly hoped so. I heard the helicopter stop up at the top of the stairs. The ticket taker took one look at my gun and backed away from the glass opening. "Call the police!" I shouted. He shook his head, held his hands up, and shooed them at me. In a go-away motion, I heard the clatter of footsteps on the stairs behind me. I propped Scott against a billboard advertising condoms. He still hadn't regained consciousness. I hid behind a metal pillar at the top of the stairs. I watched 3 of them creeping forward. I let them get halfway there before I took careful aim and fired 3 rounds. They darted backward. I could no longer afford to waste ammunition. I heard no police sirens. I didn't bother to stare to see whether I'd hit any of them. I heard the sound of a train. I scrambled to Scott. I got his left arm around my shoulder and put my right around his waist. I pulled and dragged him the few feet to the edge of the platform. Moments later, the 2-car train pulled in. I yanked us into the second car as the doors closed. I looked back to see 2 guys with guns drawn running up the last few stairs. The train pulled out. I eased Scott into a seat. A black woman in a bright yellow shawl and a teenager in an Oakland Raiders jacket stared at us. I stuck the gun in my belt, then sat down next to Scott. I took out my hanky and dabbed at the places where blood still oozed from Scott's head. I kept murmuring, "Wake up, Scott. Come on, lover, please." But he didn't revive, and nothing I tried brought him around. His breathing remained ragged and uneven. I felt 2 inches to the right of his Adam's apple. His pulse was still strong. The black woman stepped softly close to us. Her breasts were gigantic, and her butt completely filled the aisle. "You all right?" she whispered. The sight of me as a mud-encrusted, blood-splattered human didn't seem to faze her. "It's my lover," I said, not caring what she thought of gay people. The woman sat on the other side of Scott. She said, Can I help? I cradled Scott's head in my arms. I didn't remember when I started to cry. She said, "It's going to be all right." She stood up, patted me on the shoulder, marched to the front of the car, and disappeared through the connecting door to the one in front. Briefly, I heard the click of the tracks louder, then softer. With the door closed, then again, louder moments later, when she returned. She came back and sat next to me. She said, "The motorman's called the police. They'll meet you at the next station." She put her hand on my shoulder. At that moment, that human warmth from a stranger was all the world to me. At the next stop, she helped me maneuver Scott off the train. I had hoped to see the swarm of uniformed cops converging on the area. I didn't want to leave the protection of the moving train with no one here to meet us. What if the drug criminals decided to pursue us from station to station? It wouldn't take them that long to hop in cars and scramble after us, but I noted that the train didn't move. Perhaps the motorman was waiting as we were to see what the moment held. We struggled forward a few steps toward the stairs leading down. I loosened the gun in my belt in case it was needed. Finally, I saw the top of a Chicago Beat cop's hat begin to emerge from the steps. I'd never been more glad to see members of the local constabulary. Within seconds, the glow from rotating Mars lights heralded what I chose to view as the tardy but welcome cavalry. In minutes, an ambulance arrived and paramedics rushed up. They worked magnificently. The woman in charge barked a steady stream of sensible commands as the three blue-clad paramedics hunted through their oversized toolbox for medicines and cures. The rapidity and precision with which they worked gave me confidence. The woman spoke into her hand radio. "Estimated time of arrival at your location, 11 minutes. She requested a number of medical items to be available when they arrived. Getting the stretcher down the stairs was far easier than I expected. If I'd had time for any thought besides that for Scott's health, I'd have realized that working in Chicago, it would be common for them to have to bring people down flights of stairs from 2- and 3-story homes and apartments. The African-American woman held my hand for a few moments as they loaded Scott's unconscious form into the ambulance. At least no one had slipped a sheet or blanket over his face. The woman patted me several times and said, "He's going to be all right, honey." And then she was gone in the gathering crowd. I was too distracted to stop her. I never got a chance to thank her. A Gay Mysteries audiobooks. I think it is easy to hate a label, but a face humanizes the word. So this effort is twofold: to offer comfort to those like myself that your world didn't end because you don't fit into the view of acceptable society on both sides, and in hopes of helping those with family that are LGBTQ, that it doesn't mean we are aliens from the child they once knew. Reassure them so they can maybe be supportive at the same time, being true to their values.